Hi booktube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing okay. Today I'm going to talk a bit about some books that I'd like to reread. So a little while ago, there were a few sort of list videos going around that people were making. So I know people were talking about some of their favourite books or their favourite authors, and sort of definitive lists of their like all-time favourites. And also people were talking about their most reread books as well. And with both of those kinds of lists, I was feeling a bit tentative about joining in with the favourite books or favourite authors. I'm always a little fearful of being so definitive about it, although it might be worth making a list and with the proviso that it's who I consider my favourite at the moment, I suppose. Even so, I found that kind of thing really, really hard. And then with the most reread books, I feel like it would be quite arbitrary for me doing that, since there are very few books that I've read more than 2 times. So yeah, again, a bit pointless really for me to do them. But instead, I thought I'd do this. I thought I'd do a list of 10 books. I think it's 10 books. We'll find out. 10 books that I would like to reread. And I'd like to reread them probably for a few different reasons, so I'll try and get into that with each book. And they're sort of roughly in categories, I think. Well, the first one is an example of a big fat book that I read last year, that after finishing it I immediately felt like I needed to reread it, and I haven't yet. Then we've got some poetry, and then we've sort of got the rest that's, yeah, so it's not really categories at all. But the first one is, a really big, pretentious book that I read last year, and yeah, immediately after finishing it, just felt like this is a book that I am going to want to keep coming back to. And that's the Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. I'm keeping Tolstoy and Dostoevsky off this list just because I've been talking a fair bit about them recently. But with the Magic Mountain, so for one thing, it's the world that you're in. It's kind of like The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, the way that you're sort of pulled into this world, and it's all about its particular historical moment, and it's really examining that. I haven't put The Name of the Rose on this list, but it was very, very close. But yeah, but with this, he's I suppose so many characters are representing where Europe was at that time, and the different sort of political and cultural pressures and changes. So all of that is fascinating. The characters themselves are fascinating, but also something that comes to mind. I don't think I can find it, but there's a whole chapter that consists of a long conversation between two characters, and I would say that maybe might be overestimating now, but it at least feels like 80% of the chapter is in French, because their whole conversation is in French. My French is not very good at all. I could sort of roughly kind of glean what they were talking about by sort of scanning through it, but I think if I was to read it again, I would either have to try and find another translation. This is the H.G. Lowe Porter translation, but at least in the UK, I've been finding it hard to find an edition that isn't this translation. Or I could read this again, this edition again, and when I get to the French, I'll just have to slow down, and I'll have to painstakingly translate it myself, and just work out exactly what they're saying, because I feel like I was missing out on something there, because there's absolutely no footnotes, there's no endnotes or anything, so you're just totally left to your own devices. So that's what I'd like to get to, and I'm undecided about exactly how to go about rereading it, but I definitely feel like I do. And then two works of poetry. I've got a slim one and then a bigger one. For the slim one, I'm going with 4 Quartets by T.S. Eliot. I think this is the best thing that T.S. Eliot has written. Yeah, it's been, I don't know, maybe 3, coming on 4 years since I read this. And I was just really, really struck by, I don't know, there's a very sort of quiet, ponderous kind of beauty to this. I think it's maybe the most philosophical thing that T.S. Eliot wrote. It's, I think, all about change in time and history and, I suppose, kind of endurance. And if I'm remembering correctly, a fair bit of this was written during the Second World War and during the Blitz. And so there's, at least in moments, a kind of feeling of togetherness and hope in there as well. But it's also probably the hardest thing by T.S. Eliot as well. But I absolutely loved it first time round. I'd like to read it really slowly and see exactly what's going on. Then the other poet I'd like to have another look at, and I'm really in the mood for reading at the moment, is W.S. Graham. So I've got his collected poems here, so I think it's more or less everything that he ever wrote. And what I love about W.S. Graham is he can be really, really exuberant and all over the place, but then sometimes he's also really concise, and he can kind of jump between those things. And he has a sense of humour, and it's weird because sometimes I really don't like self-consciousness in poetry, or I don't like it when a poet is consciously showing you their tricks, and they're kind of just being like, oh, look at how clever I am. But in this, he kind of does that, but he's kind of making fun of poets who do that. And it's I'll probably read it soon for a Poetry Thursday. It's called Enter a Cloud, which is just basically a description of a nice sort of coastal scene. He's up on a hill, looking down at the sort of the cliffs and the sea and the clouds moving across the horizon. And then he gets to a point towards the end of the poem when he's suddenly feeling very proud about having written this poem. And so he's thanking all of the elements that have sort of made up the poem up to that point, as if it's like some kind of speech at an award ceremony. So it's like, I'd like to thank the cloud and the hill and the sea and these particular words, and he lists off his favourite words from the poem and stuff like that. And it's just really odd, but I find it really just really fun and kind of wholesome. He's not really being pretentious, but he is brilliant at the same time. So it's a nice mix. I'm not sure if I've explained him as well, so I might read a little more W.S. Graham for Poetry Thursdays, just so you can experience it a bit more. Next up, we've got a novel that I'd like to reread because I've read it twice, and I've enjoyed it for the story and for the ideas. But I've heard people read it back, or read sections back, and the writing has just sounded really, really bad. And so I want to reread it and see. I'm going to enjoy the story and the ideas anyway, but I want to sort of pay attention more to the writing this time round, and just see what it's like. Not that it really matters, because I'll still love the book, and that's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. And this is the only thing by Philip K. Dick I've read, so maybe after rereading this for the for the third time, I should read something else by him. But yeah, definitely I need to read more sci-fi, but I just want to see what the writing is like, and yeah, we'll see from there. Then next up, this is one that really made an impression on me when I read it. I think it was mostly just a writer that I just loved their voice and the way that they wrote, and then just the issues coming up in the book. But I think it's mostly just the storytelling and the feeling of the book. And that's Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. And I've read The Bluest Eye and Beloved as well, but this is, I think, still my favourite. So I'd quite like to reread this and just experience it all again and see exactly what it was that was making such a such a big impression on me when I read it the first time round. Yeah, I need to read much more Morrison, but I've been thinking for quite a long time I'd like to reread this. Then we've got a couple of short story writers. The first up is Silvina Campo. This is The Imposter and Other Tales. And I read her last year. I was just really, really impressed. A lot of her stories are really surreal and odd, kind of weird. And often they're really, really cruel. They're kind of portraits of human cruelty. And I really, really loved it, but was kind of just going through to kind of get a feel for her writing. So I'd like to spend a bit more time particularly on certain stories that stood out to me, and I'll just read them a little more closely and see what I think. And then this is one, I suppose I'd like to read this author again and this book again for a similar reason to the Song of Solomon, that when I read it, there was just something to it that I couldn't quite put my finger on, that I really, really loved. And part of it was the writing and the style and the voice. There might have been something else going on there as well, and I'd like to try and put my finger on that. And that's Flannery O'Connor. A Good Man is Hard to Find. And this is the only thing that I've read by Flannery O'Connor. So, like with Philip K. Dick, I think if I have a great experience with this, I think it will encourage me to go out and get some more Flannery O'Connor and read that too. I've just noticed I've got a really bad habit when I'm talking about a book. I'll hold it up, and then while I'm talking about it, I'll just flick through it, and you can't see that I'm flicking through it, but I don't know why I do that. And then next up, again, similar to Ocampo, it's one I read last year. I was really impressed by it. I've bought loads of other books by this author because I was impressed by him. But I still want to go back to this one because it's a book that has a bit of a twist ending, and I'd like to read it in that light, sort of knowing what I know now. And that's Chasing Homer by Laszlo Krasznahorkai. I've got I think 5 other Krasznahorkai books, and I've read one more. I've read The Last Wolf, which is a bind up of a couple of his sort of long short stories. But this is just a really odd, absurd story about someone who feels like they're being chased and they're sort of dashing across Europe. And every chapter is just one running sentence. So there's a real sense of restlessness to this. And I think when I read it the first time round, I was just sort of rushing along in that pace, not really paying too much attention. And so I'd like to give it another go now that I know what I know about it, having got to the end. Then this one is a kind of a booktube recommends kind of thing. It's based off seeing someone talking about it. And I read it a while ago, and I've been wanting to reread it for a while. And seeing them talk about it has given me that push. I'm flicking through again, and I haven't even shown you the book. But it's The Monk, so you can't really see that from there. It's on the spine by Matthew Lewis, and Tilly from Tilly's Shelf was talking about this recently, and I really liked it the first time through, and I mean I think there are things that there are things in there that are really odd and disturbing, but I think there's just something about Gothic novels that they're often a bit of a romp, and they're just fun. And I picked it up I think for quite cheap actually in a folio edition. The box is empty on the shelf now, and it's got these lovely illustrations in it, and so that's just another incentive for me to reread it. I'm just trying to find I'm not flicking through randomly now. I'm trying to find an illustration for you. So that's just another reason for me to go back and reread this one. And then the last one, I believe, number 10, is I think the only non-fiction on here, other than the poetry, and that's Red Comet. So the short life and blazing art of of Sylvia Plath. The short life and blazing art of Sylvia Plath by Heather Clark. And I was reading this, or I started reading it around the time I started a booktube channel. So that was a couple of years ago now, I think, and really loved it. Sylvia Plath is one of my favourite authors. Thinking about it now, that The Bell Jar is definitely a book that could make it onto this list, and I'll probably try to read this year if I can. But I think the thing I loved about this was just seeing her develop, whether it's emotionally or intellectually. You're seeing her writing grow. You're seeing what she's reading. There's just an amazing chapter about one of her teachers and the recommended reading that her teacher was giving. So it was just an amazing just sort of window into Plath's life. So it's something that I'd really love to experience again, I suppose. So and this is the only really dedicated biography of Plath that I've read. I've read other things that have sort of touched on her, but this is the only dedicated one I've read, but I'd love to read it again. So there we go, that's 10 books. I'll try and do a little stack. So I would like to reread Red Comet by Heather Clark, The Monk by Matthew Lewis, Chasing Homer by Laszlo Krasznahorkai. Working out how I should hold them now. Let's hold them like that. We've got A Good Man Is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. We've got The Imposter and Other Tales by Silvina Ocampo, who was a good friend of Borges. So that's just another kind of attraction I have to her as a writer, that kind of sort of odd, quirky world of literature. Then we've got Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. We've got Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. We've got the collected poems of W.S. Graham. We've got 4 Quartets by T.S. Eliot. No idea if you can see that. And then we've got The Magic Mountain as well. So these are just 10 of the books that I'd like to reread in maybe the short term or medium term future. So I don't know, in the next year or 2 years maybe. And we'll see how I do. This isn't a totally set plan. It's really just looking at the shelves, looking for books that I've read, and seeing which ones are kind of screaming to be reread. That, as I said, there are a few others that are on the periphery of the list, like The Bell Jar and like The Name of the Rose, and there are a few others, and they might swap their way in. But for today, that's my list, and they'll be probably niggling around in the back of my head whenever I pick up any other book. So there we go, that's my list. And I'd be curious to see what other people have to say about this. Maybe even if it isn't a list of books people want to reread, but just a discussion about why you do it, and you might want to reread different books for different reasons and things like that. So anyway, I'll go now. I've just made 2 videos in the full knowledge that I'm not really awake enough to be talking. So I'll leave it there, and I'll see you soon. Bye.